What I hope to cover today is actually several topics that you already mentioned, and they go, here it is. They go from, as you can see, from basically three topics. Global income inequality, a little bit about the inequality in the United States, and a little bit more about inequality in China. Zhuo was very kind to mention that study China. I've been actually studying China for a while, but obviously my knowledge is quite imperfect. So I would be very happy to, hear comments today. So these are the three topics that I would like to cover. I actually start with global inequality because, as you know, many of you imagine, China plays a very important role in global inequality. But on top of that, there are changes in global inequality today which are unusual and actually which are really worthwhile emphasizing. Let me give you the background. First, global inequality is technically inequality between all citizens in the world. You would ask me later, and I will not go over that, how we have the data, because obviously the data from the past, from the 19th century, are very, fragmentary. But we do actually have data on GDP per capita. We have data on income distribution, not ideal data, but certainly something. So essentially, we can chart three different periods in global inequality, which again means inequality in income between all individuals in the world, technically. If you start with early 19th century, you see that inequality in terms of Gini index is pretty high, 55 Gini points, which is really quite high. It's like inequality in South Africa today or Brazil. But then you notice throughout the 19th century, it keeps on going up and up all the way to early 20th century. And then it stays at that very high level. And then finally, that's the most interesting part and the important part for us, is that actually starts going down in the beginning of the 21st century. Now, why did inequality chart the three different periods? The first one was really the period of the Industrial Revolution and what you can call the rise of the West. This is important because if you think of the world as really three parts, because they're the most important parts in terms of population, are the West, India, and China. What happened in the 19th century is the Western countries, basically Europe, but also North America, and then later Japan, became much richer, whereas China actually went even down and India was stagnating. That created what is called the Great Divergence and the very high increase of inequality. So you notice that increase of inequality going up throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century. Then we actually have very high inequality after World War II and the US dominant role in the world. The inequality is extremely high, but as you notice on that slide, it's not increasing. But then starts actually with the rise of China in the 1980s, inequality starts declining. And the reason is very simple, and I really would like everybody to understand that, is what happens with the rise of China and India a little bit later, is that these countries originally are relatively poor, and then they grow very fast. And this is something which technically, as you can see, almost arithmetically, is going to reduce inequality, because you have a very high income growth among people who are not very rich. And this is actually what is happening now. However, I will have to explain that actually in the most recent period, we have had some changes there, especially in change in China's role, but it will come in a minute. So differently, what I already said, actually, you can see the same slide. Actually, I'm now breaking the slide that I've shown you previously into two parts. One part which simply shows the total inequality if each country had full equality among itself, and the only inequality in the world would be inequality between countries. So this is the blue bar that you can see here. As you notice here, you have the rising inequality because in the 19th century, because of the increasing gaps between Western countries, and India and China on the other hand. And then you notice that in the 21st century, the opposite movement, reduced gap because of the rise of China and India. Also, you had during that first period an increased inequality within countries. Now that cannot be seen as maybe as clearly, but the orange bar gradually becomes bigger and bigger, indicating rising inequalities within countries. And then rising inequality within countries remains very high, at a very high peak in the 20th century, and still is actually significant today. So in other words, to some you have a reduction in global inequality because of rise of India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, most of very large Asian countries, whose rate of growth is higher than the rate of growth of the West. But within countries, you have very often rising inequality. And this is something that I would cover in the next part of the talk when I talk about China and the United States. Another way to see the rise of Asia, I actually here have a comparison in PPP dollars between China and the US on the left-hand side, and then India and Germany on the right-hand side. Of course, the scales are not the same, but of course you notice here that China in PPP terms around 2015 or 2016 becomes the largest economy in the world. And then you also notice, for example, large change in positions between India and Germany. In the 1960s, the two countries had more or less the same share of the global GDP. Then Germany's share went up and India's share went down. But since 1980, the opposite movement happens. Actually, India's share, similarly to China's share with respect to the US, is increasing. But I have to mention one interesting thing, which is quite important. China has been a major engine, the motor of the reduction of global inequality, for the reasons that I just explained. And then you see here from 1978, approximately, you notice that this slide shows the line, which is actually the solid line, which when it is below zero, shows the China's contribution to the reduction of global inequality. As you notice, that contribution is lasting all the years and is actually quite significant. But notice that at the end, that contribution becomes less. Now, the reason is not that the growth rate is less. The reason is that China has become an upper middle income country. So when you get to that point, you no longer, as I will actually show you here, actually in this slide, you no longer contribute to the reduction of global inequality. In other words, when the country becomes sufficiently rich, the effect on global inequality is being reduced. So, for example, now, Chinese growth is neutral as far as global inequality is concerned. As China continues becoming richer and richer, as you can see here, for example, China's GDP per capita is now higher than the GDP per capita of 97 countries in the world, accounting for almost 60% of the world population. And as China becomes even richer, it would actually begin contributing to global inequality. So this is a very important point for many people because we are still used to saying, well, if China continues growing at 6%, it would actually reduce global inequality. It is no longer the case. It would, of course, reduce global poverty, but it is not going to reduce global inequality, which then has very important implications for global inequality. It means that countries in Africa and India become crucial for the reduction of global inequality. And I will not talk today more about that, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that while China has been the crucial engine of the reduction of global inequality for almost 40 years, the very fact that it has become now a sort of an upper middle income country or relatively wealthy country means that it is no longer that engine. And that engine now has to be India and has to be Africa, which is the only continent also whose population is rising now and will continue to rise in the next probably 50 years, if not more. So this is what I wanted to say about global inequality very briefly, because we are now at a very special point in global inequality. Very few people actually even know that, and it is very important to mention, especially because the evolution of different countries' GDPs as a result of COVID has been very different. As you know, India has had really two really very bad years in terms of growth. China, on the other hand, has had positive growth last year, and it would probably have a growth of 5 to 6% this year. So the gaps between these two countries are increasing. And this is, of course, the result of COVID, and we will see what will happen when the pandemic is over. So now let me just say a few things about inequality in the United States, and that's part of my book. And I will not go through all of this too long. And also, I would like to concentrate on the points which are also relevant for China, not only for the United States, but first I would actually cover them in the case of the United States. So the first point that I would cover is the rising importance of capital income in total income, and the fact that capital income is very concentrated. So again, that's something which I think should be intuitively obvious. What would be the effect? If you have one source of income, which is capital, that is very concentrated, and that source of income is increasing in importance, it is going to push overall inequality up. So I think it's relatively easy to see. If you had a source of income which is egalitarian and which is rising, then it would push inequality down. But if you have a source of income like capital, which is going up in size and is very unequal, then it would obviously push inequality up. So this is the first highlight of inequality in the United States, as you will see in a moment, also inequality in China. Secondly, a very important phenomenon, an interesting phenomenon which we observe, is that more and more people at the very top are not only rich in terms of capital income, but they are rich also in terms of labor income. This is something which, using Greek words, I have called homoplutia, which in Greek means equally wealthy. So some people at the top, and actually increasing percentage of people at the top, are now rich both because they have high wages, high labor income, and they have lots of their income from property. So this is a new phenomenon. You know, in a classical capitalism that, of course, one reads with David Ricardo and Karl Marx, you have capitalists who have income from capital, but they don't have income from labor. And you have workers who have income from work only. But nowadays, we have people who are both rich in terms of labor income and capital income. And finally, another element which will be also, I think, from what I've seen is present in China and is present in the US, and I will show you numbers in a minute, is that more and more people marry people who are very similar in terms of education or income to them. So that, of course, pushes inequality up. So let me then just simply concentrate on these 3 points in the case of the United States. First, as I mentioned, inequality of labor incomes is generally, actually always, lower than inequality of capital incomes. You see on that slide that US Gini, which is of course the measure of inequality which I already used, a US Gini for capital income is extremely high. It's 0.9, which is like almost as high as you can go. Labor income, however, has a Gini which is lower, which is around 0.45. So the rising share of capital income would push inequality up. On top of that, I'm sorry, it moved too fast. On top of that, you have the process of what I call homoplutia in the United States. And in this slide, it shows you the percentage of people who are in the top decile, which means that you take the richest 10% of people in the United States, and you say, what percentage of them are rich both in terms of their labor income and in terms of their capital income? And you notice here that this line goes up, saying that in the past, only 15% of such rich people were also rich in capital and labor income, and now almost a third of them are rich in both capital and labor income. Now, it has an implication that such people of course, are much more resilient to the changes in the labor market because they have lots of capital income, and they are resilient to whatever happens to the stock to the stock market because they're people with high human capital. So you have a creation of a group of people, an elite, which is really quite resilient to changes in both labor market or stock market because they are rich in both terms of labor and capital. And finally, as I mentioned, the third element that I wanted to highlight is the rising percentage of people who marry, people who are equally educated or rich like they are. This is an example with the United States with a cohort of young men who actually, if you look at this slide, the orange line is percentage of young men who are rich marrying also rich women, and rich means in terms of labor income. So it's not actually that you have inherited income, that people who are very well educated and have high wages. And the blue line is percentage of people with high wages marrying women with low wages. You notice in the 1970s that the percentages were about the same, but today the likelihood of a person, a man who is actually very well, has high earnings, marrying a woman with high earnings is almost 30%, and marrying a woman with low earnings is only 11%. This ratio for women is even stronger. It's actually 5-1. So what has happened is that actually as more women have been in the educational system and they get very high paying jobs, they're actually also postponing their marriage and they're marrying partners who are also having high income. Now, this is all good because it obviously shows you freedom to marry whoever you want and the fact that actually you can decide to marry somebody after the educational system after you have graduated. But it does, mathematically increase inequality because you have people of the same status, same wage, same education, marrying each other, and obviously people who are very highly educated and have high wages would actually by marrying each other would increase inequality. So the last point, which is also, I think, important for the US and also China, this is the example from the United States, is that the college attendance rates are directly proportional to the income of the parents. That means that essentially social mobility is lower. If you have the attendance of college, which depends whether your parents are rich or poor, then clearly the mobility between the people who are born to poorer parents and mobility and those who are born to richer parents would be reduced. So then let me go in the last part of my presentation, which will, as you will see, has actually many common points with what I showed about inequality in the US, say a few words about inequality in China. The most obvious fact, which is actually quite well known, is that if you put in one slide, I put here GDP per capita in China, this is the red line, and this is on the right-hand axis, and of course you notice that incredible increase, which is exponential. And on the other hand, you look at on the left-hand side is the Gini coefficient on the left axis, and you also notice a very high increase of inequality, which continues all the way to about 2010, and then starts going down and is basically flat. Now, we don't have, I think, as good numbers, as detailed numbers for the very recent years. I've actually here used the number that comes from the National Statistical Bureau for 2019, but you actually notice that inequality going down and then being sort of stable in the last several years. If you look at the urban and rural inequality, of course, in China too, you have, of course, large increase in urban inequality with the same tendency in the last 10 years to be about the same or slightly going down. And finally, you have the same tendency if you look at a different sorts of data. This is with micro data on wages, where, of course, private sector always has higher inequality in wages than the state sector. But you notice here too, in private and the state sector, you notice that the wage inequality has been stable, has not continued increasing since approximately the beginning, well, whether it is 2005 or maybe actually you can even see it here as 2007 or 10, but around that period. So you have sort of a confirming evidence from the overall inequality in China, from inequality between within urban and rural areas, and inequality within state and private sector of a sort of a stable inequality, but not decreasing inequality in the most recent years. And finally, let me conclude what I personally believe is that I think that actually we could define three solvable and three difficult inequalities in China. The three solvable inequalities to me are the following three. They are not easily solvable, but I think that one knows, and we know the cause of them, and we potentially know what is the solution. The first one is the share of Chinese inequality is due, it is quite well known, to inequalities between different provinces, the rich ones and the middle income ones and the poor ones, and the difference between rural and urban areas. Now, that geographical inequality accounts in China for almost a quarter of total inequality. And, actually very similar to the European Union, which is 27 different countries, but lots of inequality in the European Union is geographical. Whereas, for example, in the United States, the geographical part of inequality is very small because the differences between mean incomes between richer states and poorer states are relatively small. So the first inequality, that difference in provincial incomes, which then feeds in the overall Chinese inequality, I think is potentially solvable through increased investments and higher GDP growth rate in Western or central provinces. And I think that's, of course, part of the government policy. And while it is not an easy solution, I think that the solution is kind of possible to envisage, and in that sense, it's solvable. The second one is rural and urban inequality, which also is a very large part of total inequality in China, but that could be also solved by easier movement of labor between rural and urban areas. And the third one, which is inequality due to corruption, which we see linked to the level of people's income, is also solvable through the anti-corruption policies. So these are, in my opinion, three solvable inequalities. I'm not saying that they are easy to solve, but I think they are technically solvable. I show here on the slides, but I don't have the time now to go through each of them separately, but I just wanted again to highlight the fact that, for example, in China, I compare here China, India, Russia, US, and the European Union. You see that China, if you take all the provincial mean incomes and put them together, they actually contribute quite a lot to total inequality. This is, you can see this 24.5 Gini points in China, very similar to the European Union 23.1 points, which I already mentioned before, and much higher than in the US, where that inequality is also accounting only for 4.8 points. So much more heterogeneous sort of differences in income in China and the European Union and Russia than in the US. Another one, which is interesting, this is from the official data that show the amount for people who have been sort of convicted of corruption, the amount of money they have been convicted of embezzlement, which increases with the level of administrative unit. Of course, you can assume that people who actually embezzled more were also people who had higher incomes to start with. So in that sense, corruption is adding to inequality. As I said before, the problem is identifiable and I think fundamentally solvable. The more difficult inequalities, and I will finish with that, are the following ones. The rising share of capital income, which comes generally with development and wealth. When countries become more developed and wealthy, the part of wealth goes up and the part of income which is derived from wealth is increasing. Now, that part of income, as I was saying before, is very heavily concentrated and almost automatically leads to greater inequality. So the problem here is quite well defined. but it's not easy to solve unless the distribution of capital becomes much more equal, and that's not easily done. The second problem, which is, I think, important, and it's present in China as well, is the homoplutia, where you have people, as I was saying before, at the top who have high capital and labor income. Again, the problem is obvious, but the solution is much more difficult. And finally, the reduced social mobility if education is correlated with parental incomes. So let me show you the data from China, which come actually from different papers. You can, of course, see here the authors. This is not my work. It is actually the decreasing labor share in China, or the other way to put it, increasing share of capital income. And as I was saying before, the Gini of capital income, as you see here in China, is 0.8, and the Gini of labor income is 0.5. So the type of income which is more unequal is rising and pushing inequality up. As you see here, for example, from the micro data, you can see also that capital income is, of course, much more important for the rich people. You see here at the capital income at the top 1 percentile is many times higher. I cannot even calculate how many times higher than the income at the median. So the ratio between capital income at the top and the ratio and the capital income at the median is very high. Another, for homoplutia, this is entirely new result, which actually a co-author of mine just got very recently. Showing you here, the red dotted line is that percentage of people who are in the top decile in China, who are both rich in terms of wages and capital income. And you notice there the data go from 2003 and then 2013, I think, the last year for China. And you notice a very high increase, actually even higher increase than in the US, of people who are both sort of rich in labor income and capital income. And finally, we have also data about decreasing social mobility, where the study compared people born in different decades, people born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and on the vertical axis is an index of social mobility, whereas on the horizontal axis is simply GDP per capita. So as you notice also here, interestingly, both China and the US show a decline in social mobility with the younger generations. And as I said before, these are, in my opinion, the three difficult issues that China needs to face in terms of inequality. Once again, the rising share of capital income, number one. The problem is clear, but the solution is difficult. The rising percentage of people who have high wages and high capital income, and the declining, possibly declining social mobility among the young generation. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I went a little bit too fast, but I just didn't want to take too much time. And I also wish to finish with all the slides. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the call.
Okay, thank you, Zoshi. Thank you, Professor Branko Milanovic. It's really nice to have this opportunity to have this dialogue with you, and especially listen to your interesting and impressive speech. As Zoshi has mentioned, your slides are very full of very interesting information. Here, I would like to keep myself very brief. First, some comments. There are a lot of interesting things in your slides. First of all, what impressed me most is that you mentioned in the past 40 years, China has been major engine of limiting the global inequality. So which is, of course, some common sense. But very interestingly, you mentioned that the future, that in the coming years, coming decades, China, if grows smoothly as the past, we are going to contribute more to the global inequality. So in the future, we have to rely more on nations like India or Africa countries or other South Asian countries to limit the global inequality. But here I would like to question this prediction, okay, a little bit. From my personal opinion, so you are right that China now reaches the middle, average global. The Chinese average GDP per capita, not in PPP, but in the according to the market exchange rate, is now happen to equal to the global average level. Yeah, so which means the richer Chinese is from now on, the more global inequality tends to be. But there are some other elements that China's role play in this game, because as you know, China is turning toward an capital provider, more and more capital provider. Actually, in the past 30 years, we have already been a net capital contributor, but we saved a lot of money and put this money in the $1 trillion, at its peak, $4 trillion foreign exchange reserves, around 60% in the US bills, US Treasury bills. Yeah, and then it's the Wall Street, it's Hong Kong investment bankers, it's London financial city who distribute this capital globally. But now, since 2013, and especially recently, China is changing marginally. Yeah, so we still save $3 trillion in the US Treasury bills and European bills. But marginally, we are putting more and more money into the project of the global, periphery, which called Belt and Road Initiative, I suppose Branko have heard about. So if Chinese could be successful in this new project, which we term as part of the efforts to build the 人类命运共同体, the human community with a common destiny. So if we succeed, which means if we are successful in providing more capital to the poorest nations in the global periphery, which has been omitted, which have been neglected by the Wall Street, by the London financial city, then the China's contribution to reducing the global inequality could be continued, of course, in a different way. Before this year, we have been contributing to limiting this global inequality by developing ourselves. And in the future, we are going to make contributions to make the world an equal place, distributing in the long term, not a short-term profit-seeking projects, but in the long term, global development, which is more sustainable and more morally, I suppose, it's a better solution. Yeah, that's the first point that I want to make. The second point, which interests me, is about the term that you used, which in Chinese we seldom see, homoplosia, which means that something have the same origin, or something share the same origin. The high capital income group and the high labor income group, they concentrate to the same person, same group of people. I suppose that's something that could be solved, but just now you mentioned we can hardly solve the problem, but I suppose we can have some solution on this. Which means in the Chinese political economic system, according to your book, sorry, I did not read your whole book, but I do read some online book review about your book, Capitalism Alone. You believe that from now on, there's no alternative. But you divide into two types of capitalism. One type is the American style resembled liberalism capitalism, but another is China resembles, which is China is typically described as what's the term? Political capitalism. Is that a term? Yeah. So, but from my terminology, we call it, the Chinese call it 新时代中国特色社会主义市场经济 socialist market economy with Chinese characteristic in the new era. Here I would like to elaborate a little bit how there's a lot of definitions or other definitions alongside the term. Yeah. So first of all, of the new era. Why it's called a new era? Because we believe before 2013, that was something old. Yeah, that was a period that China joined the globalization led by United States. But after 2013, a lot of things have been changed. Yeah, later on I will describe a little bit. Another term that here we use is socialism. So as I know, you came from Eastern Europe, yeah, Southeastern Europe. Yeah, that means you have experienced the European style socialism period. I don't know what's your impression about your childhood or young age living style. Definitely there are some merits, but there are also some shortcomings, obviously. Nowadays, China's socialism, we have been arguing a lot. In fact, in the past 70 years about what is capitalism, what is socialism. In China, according to Deng Xiaoping, we define market economy by stating that the capitalists could have market economy, so do socialists. The market economy is something good, could do something good, and it should not be monopolized by the capitalists. That's how we started opening up and reform, market-oriented reform. Today, in Chinese system, we have a very active, very powerful government, but at the same time, there are very active prosperity in the private sector, especially in manufacturing sector and the service industry. So back to topic of the homopousia. I tend to, actually recently I'm cooperating with a friend, with a hedge fund manager, but also a thinker, about reform the global market economy, especially global political economic system in different states. It seems that we are converging. The whole world is converging, either Europe or China or United States. What kind of market economy should we practice? Or if in your own terminology, what kind of capitalism should we practice? Yeah. In fact, to my opinion, United States is zigzagging and now going toward a more socialist style, especially after earlier this year, as the left party, the Democrats came into power, and it seems President Biden administration, the Biden administration has been sort of kidnapped by its left wing, its own party. Yeah, they are just printing money, helicopter money, distributing wealth among the poor, among the colored people. So that's something. When I see this, I say, gosh, it's not capitalism. It's not even socialism. It's more reminiscent of the term communism. Is that right? Because recently I'm not interacting, intensely with American friends, but I don't know what the American friends, especially the right-wing people, people more pro the Republicans will think about this presidency. So they are just distributing wealth. In China, we are also thinking about redistributing wealth. But the problem is, in the past 50 years or 70 years, European states have provided a a model, yeah, or several models, which different from each other slightly, which is about welfare state. Yeah, but now it seems the welfare state has its cost because it discourages people from working hard, according to some of the theorists and observers. Yeah, it discourages people. So on the one hand, we do want to limit the inequality in one nation. But if you provide too much social welfare, it may result the the enjoying life leisure of older people. Yeah, that's human beings. That means, from long-term speaking, the whole nation, the whole rich nation, will slow down its growth, slow down its improvement, progress in the competition among the nations. So how can we balance that kind of two costs and benefits? So our solution, I mean, my own suggestion together with my co-author, is that we should adjust a little bit about the social welfare system. On one hand, we should improve Chinese social welfare. Obviously, China, we call ourselves socialism, but we are still not socialism enough. Yeah? But we should build up our social welfare system in a very different way from the Europeans, which means, you know, a lot of money from the public sector being wasted or being invested to save old people's life for extra 1 month or extra 1 year. It's very costly. So our suggestion is that the public sector's intervention in ordinary people's life and wealth distribution should be aimed at mitigate or minimize the inequality among the young people, which means some young people was born in poor and stupid family. Yeah, the parents are poorly educated, and the parents have no capital, have no money, have less saving. They live miserable life. Being born into these families, it's not a fault of the people. It's not a choose. It's not a choice of the kid. It's not. They were chosen. They are not. It's not their choices. So, but for adults like us, people over 40 or 45 or 50, they should be responsible for their own behavior, for their own choices. So here's a balance. On the one hand, we should compensate for those young people born by a poor parents, by a poor and stupid parents. But at the same time, we should encourage individuals, encourage families to invest, to save, to be responsible for their own choices. So that's my suggestions. We should, you know, on one hand, we should improve our social welfare system. On the other hand, we should decrease, limit the benefits that old people should get, and invest heavily into young people. This suggestion makes more sense, especially in the Chinese case, because maybe Branko have heard about. In the past 30 or 40 years, 30 years, we have been practicing extra taxing system. Yeah, let's say invisible tax system, by printing more money than needed, and by get the land at a low price from the farmers and sell it cheaply, sell it very expensively to the market. So the result is a deprivation or exploitation among the generations. People my generation, I was born in 1970s. I benefited a lot from this game because I bought houses earlier than my peers. So the result is I got a lot of capital gains from what you mentioned. In United States case, it's mainly the ever rising, continuous rising of the stock market. In China's case, it's a similar curve of the real estate price manipulated by the government. So who is paying the cost? It's my son's generation. Yeah, it's my son's generation. It's young people who today join our Zoom talk. These people, they may be very talented, they may work very hard, they may go to very well education. Unfortunately, they can hardly by themselves, they could hardly pay for a house, or not even house, just flat or apartment at a fair price. So that's, I call it transgenerational exploitation. So in China's case, we should compensate that kind of exploitation. And finally, I'd like to, a final point that I want to make is about the concentration of the capital ownership. Yeah. Here I would like to mention something different, or according to my own perspective, own framework of understanding of today's world, something maybe more important is about the concentration of the ownership of data instead of capital. What is capital? Before 1971, capital means gold or something derived from gold. After 1971, gold is no longer currency. So capital means credit. Capital means credit created by the big governments. So after that, we have been witnessing the decrease of the scarcity of the capital, even in the whole world, especially after the 1980s, as China joined the US-led globalization. And after 1991, the Eastern Bloc dissolved and was absorbed by the globalization system. So then the whole world was evolved into a one system, capitalist system, globalization system. So since then, step by step, we have witnessing the growing saving rate of the whole world. Sorry, I did not make the, I did not have the data about this presumption, I suppose, but from my personal impression, the scarcity of capital have been decreasing since 1980s. Today, as the interest rate goes zero or even negative, that capital scarcity is diminishing or disappearing, especially at the center of the whole world system. Then what is more important? So in the agricultural society, I mean, before 1800, the whole world, the most important game is about the ownership of the land. After 1820s, gradually first from England, then Western Europe and the United States, and then Soviet Union, blah, blah. Gradually, the most important game is ownership of the capital. But today, land or capital are no longer that scale. The most important thing is data ownership. I believe today we are marching, the whole world is marching toward a new era. So, and we are witnessing different approaches in different systems in solving this data ownership problem. In the US's case, it seems that the big platforms, the Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, these big platforms, they own this data. And it seems it's not the stock owners of these big platforms. It's mainly the team who is running these platforms. They actually own these data globally. Think about the case of the former president, Mr. Donald Trump. His Twitter was shut down, and some other nation leaders of other developing countries, their Twitter account could also be manipulated. So these platforms are concentrating more and more wealth and power. In the past decade, we have witnessing the ever rising of the price, the bubble of, I should not call it a bubble, but because they are really making money. fast rising of the surge of the price of this fund, FANG fund, and these small companies are afraid to that. Now, the same case happens in China. China's political economic system, we are trying to find a solution, a balanced solution. On the one hand, we have to protect them and rely on them for the global competition. But at the same time, we have to limit them, restrict them, regulate them. Yeah? That's a recent effort that we are making. And the Europeans seems they have no platforms at all, which is very unfortunate. And if I'm right, they are more or less doomed in this global competition. And they are now trying to make some efforts to struggle to compensate for their they just lost a decade in this competition. Yeah. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you very much. These are my comments.
Well, thank you very much, Professor D, for excellent comments. I really appreciate them. And I would try to go over the key comments without taking too much time. Just let me say briefly. First, let me take your comment number 2. I think I've made 5 different headings. Number 2, because I don't want terminology to influence things very much. My book is indeed called, as you said, Capitalism Alone, but I did not actually talk about that today because I'm fine with a different terminology. If one can say, actually, some people have mentioned that to me before, the terminology could be used, capitalist market economy and socialist market economy. It is fine with me, actually. As you said, actually, Deng Xiaoping was also talking about market economy. It was capitalist and socialist. So, terminologically, I would not argue much about that. I do actually agree with you, and that's also one of the parts of my book when I use the word TINA, because it is indeed true that the world is converging. So when we say there is no alternative, what we mean is that ideologically, people are not coming up with different ideas how to organize production than the way that we are doing it now, which is mostly by profit, by using wage labor, and by decentralized coordination. So we all agree, I think, that this is the main way that all countries are doing that in the world now. So that was the point number 2. But so let me go by, I just want to clarify this terminological issue that I don't really particularly stand by one terminology or another. But now, let me go to the number 1, which actually I'm very glad that you mentioned that it was about global inequality and the role of China. Indeed, the role of the Belt and Road Initiative could be precisely to accelerate growth in Africa, which, as I was saying, is absolutely crucial for the reduction in global inequality in the future. But technically, and when I calculate things from the country's point of view. So while China might contribute to the acceleration of growth in Africa, it would still, simply because we do the calculation by countries, it would simply add to global inequality in the future if it continues to grow at the rate that, of course, people project now, whether it is, say, 5, 6, or whatever percentage points, it would simply add to global inequality. And this is something which I think is inevitable when one becomes richer. If he continues becoming richer at a faster rate than somebody who is behind, he would contribute to inequality. So it is simply technical issue. Now, whether China would be successful in helping growth in Africa would be very important for the world, but of course this is an indirect effect and not a direct effect. But I agree with that point, actually, and I think it is true. It is simply that it still makes China, as it becomes a rich country, a richer country and eventually a rich country, would actually be a contributor to global inequality. Then let me just say a few words about what you mentioned about intergenerational inequality, which I think is quite important, and it's quite important again in many countries which face very similar issue with aging population. As you, of course, know much better, China faces that, the results of the new census are just out, and of course, the population is getting older, and because it is bulky, lots of people would, at a given year, move into the older groups. Countries like Japan or Korea or countries in Europe, of course, face it is even more because they have the negative population growth rate, even in the US. So it is, I think, a global problem of the rich countries. It's not being faced by Africa, but it's faced by the rest of the world. And then this generational inequality is, as you know, quite present in the US as well. The previous generation benefited, and in Europe, benefited for high growth rates. They actually were able to save quite a lot. They have accumulated first wealth in the financial assets. They have actually become very skilled, high skilled and have high wages. And the system that you mentioned, the welfare system, made sure that they get very high pensions when they retire. And for the young people, they have to start with really much worse starting position. Actually, obviously, they are now wealthier than they were, like their parents in the beginning, like 50 years ago, but their chances of improvement are much less. So this is, I think, a general problem, and I very much, I don't know more details about what you explained, but I very much agree that there is a generational aspect to inequality, which is not often brought out. And my final point is about capital. Now, I also agree on that point with you, but my perspective in the data that here is from the point of view of individual. So what I call capital income could be also called ownership income. In other words, I don't know where that capital income comes from. So it can come from ownership of assets. It can come from data, as you said. It could come from land. It could come from shares. It could come from rents. So it's really all of that together. Your point, of course, was more of a macro or maybe financial side to say that, of course, the dominant type of capital, which used to be land, and then became physical capital, or actually, as you said, became gold to some extent until 1971, when the system of fixed exchange rates was stopped. That capital is now a very different type of capital. So I fully agree with that. But when I look at individual incomes, I simply notice that they have income from property. And that property can very well be actually property in data, property in platform, property in what is called intangible wealth, which is not wealth, like as you know, of course, as you said, it is not the wealth that actually we can touch, but this is the wealth that is very often, like we are talking now, it's a wealth that is Zoom or Facebook or Google or whatever. So, as I said, I agree with that, but my capital income was not only income from the old-fashioned capital, it includes also the income from the new capital. And maybe final point, just to mention, when you said homoplatia, yes, it's an entirely new term, so nobody has been using it much. Actually, I invented the word in my book because I observed from the data that in the US, I started observing that more and more people have this double function of being rich sort of recipients of capital income and being also rich among wage earners. And then I looked at other countries. I showed you the data for China today as well, but then I looked at many other countries, and that percentage is rising. But what was also interesting, and that's my last point, is that countries which are more, how should I say, a little bit more closer to the old-fashioned capitalism, like Mexico and Brazil, have relatively small percentage of such people. And the reason is that very rich capitalists in Mexico are not often becoming, lawyers or software engineers or doctors, they are actually very happy being rich companies. But in a more advanced capitalist system, and then includes China, as you have seen in numbers, there is an increasing percentage of people who are both. I think this is all, except, yes, I wanted also to mention, that was the previous point about the generational issue. I think it's really a huge issue. And I think we see it also quite well in China when you mentioned, and I read actually daily Chinese papers, the issue of young people actually getting apartments and having really not having savings, and oftentimes, of course, having to depend on their parents to give them savings for that, and then postponing decision to have a family, postponing decision to have children. So all of that is very much linked together. And this is the issue that I mentioned at the very end, is the issue of social mobility, which is actually quite crucial. And it combines two features: social mobility with respect to your parents. As you said, there is no reason why somebody who was born to poor parents should actually not have the same access to education and everything else. And it's a generational inequality. So let me stop there. I think that I have covered, I think, all the major points from your comments. Thank you very much again for really being excellent comments.